My name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I've been teaching the LSAT for about 15 years now, and I had my own personal LSAT journey going from a 152 to a 175. That's not the agenda for tonight, of course, though. We're going to be talking about recent updates given the coronavirus situation, and I'm joined tonight by my good friend, Ivey, former UChicago Law Dean of Admissions. How are you doing, Anna?
I'm good. How are you? Sheltering in place.
Sheltering in place, and you're over in Los Angeles, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We haven't peaked yet the way I think you guys are ahead of us in New York. So we're still waiting for the worst to come, but we're definitely feeling for you guys in New York.
Thanks. I appreciate it. You know, I've always thought New York was the leading city, but I certainly didn't want to be leading in this category. Unfortunately, we're all pretty much at home, not going outside too much. And of course, the news is pretty scary. So I'm doing my best to protect myself, wearing a mask, not going out, that sort of thing.
Good.
Yeah, I hope everyone's staying safe out there and you're all trying to minimize your going out, staying home, being online. You're in the right place right now, joining us from the safety of your computer or tablet or smartphone. So anyway, thought we could have an interesting discussion tonight, given all the recent changes with coronavirus, specifically as it affects LSAT and law school admissions, what could be happening this current cycle finishing up, as well as what could be happening in the upcoming cycle and beyond.
Yeah. So I'm Anna. Hi, Anna Ivey. And the applicants that we've been working with this season are in for a pretty wild ride, I think, because law schools have no way of gauging how many people are actually going to show up in the fall. And it's tough for applicants because I think almost all of the admitted students weekends got canceled. Mm-hmm. So if you haven't visited that law school, it's really hard to commit to one if you haven't set foot there. The good news, such as it is, the good news is that if you are on a wait list, hang in there, because I think there's going to be a lot of movement, much more than usual, in the summer. Because I think there are going to be more people who are going to want to defer because of this uncertainty and not knowing whether it's going to be, an in-person experience or all online. I would say if it's your dream school or a reach school and you get that offer off the wait list, grab it. Who cares if it's online the first year? It doesn't matter. It's your dream school, right? If you're not certain about whether that's okay with you to do an online program, you can defer applying for a year or two. You don't have to apply this fall. But we don't have that crystal ball. Nobody does. I wish we did. That would be awesome.
I'm really glad you raised that point, though, because I've been thinking, if it's not your dream school, or if you're not getting all the scholarship offers you want, is it worth taking the risk to potentially start online law school in the fall? I imagine that's not really how people typically imagine their 1L starting off. Is it better to maybe hold off and wait a year, wait a cycle, when things may have shaken out a bit more?
Yeah, the first year is such an important bonding experience. Anyone who's gone to law school remembers their first year. Second and third year, are kind of a little bit more normal, all things considered. First year is when you're making a lot of lifelong friendships. And can you replicate that online? I don't know. I mean, personally, I've taken classes for fun, both in a real world setting and online. I think they're very different. And I think professors are doing a heroic job trying to get, all their learning and all their teaching delivered online. And I think a lot of them are doing it in a fairly entertaining way. So I don't worry about the education component. I do worry about the sort of the bonding component and the social component. And law school is really, 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 really hard, no matter where you go. And so having that support of your peers next to you, I think really goes a long way. But who am I to say don't go to law school if it's online for a year? You're going to have 2 years after that. It's fine, and the world needs you. There might be benefit to getting out of law school a year earlier than otherwise, right? So I don't think it's a deal breaker, but some people might be allergic to that. And if you're allergic to that, law school's not going anywhere. And eventually they'll come offline again, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm wondering, do you think that the current cycle finishing up now will be a little bit less competitive than the coming cycle? That's my intuition, because I'm feeling people are kind of uncertain about the future. They don't want to maybe commit to a 3-year endeavor right now, but maybe 6 months from now, they'll feel more comfortable doing that.
Maybe. Usually what we see when the economy gets rocky, and Lord knows that's already happening, we see this flight to safety, meaning this is a great time to go to law school when the economy sucks and you don't know if you're going to have a job. You can kind of ride it out for 3 years in law school and hope things have turned around by the time you get out. So in a lot of ways, law school admissions or the volume of applicants tends to be counter-cyclical. So I'm not an economist. It seems to me that we're certainly heading into a recession. And so the question is it going to be a sort of a short, sharp one, or is it going to be sort of a longer, dragged out one? I don't know. That's not my area of expertise. But whenever things are bad economically, you tend to see an upswing in law school applications. So it could cut the other way. That could mean there's just more people applying and therefore it's more competitive. So I wish I had more certainty for you. I don't.
No, that's my thought as well, honestly, that this cycle, due to the uncertainty, applicants may not commit now towards the end of this cycle. And of course, with the March and April LSATs not happening, the April LSAT will almost certainly be canceled.
Let's talk about that.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Can I just say, it really pisses me off that they haven't canceled it yet. That is
Same.
just so delusional. And, to law school applicants, I would say just assume it's going to be canceled. And I think you have until tomorrow, I think, to reschedule it at no cost. I would say go ahead and reschedule it. April is not happening. Why LSAC doesn't just say this is, I don't know, it's a mystery to me. So April probably not happen, almost certainly not happening. Is May going to happen? I don't know. I mean, here in LA, I think they just extended the shelter in place into May. So if
Virginia extended it into June. So they can't possibly do an April. They've talked about maybe doing a May, maybe doing something in between April and June, but
that might
they're not going to be able to get it together in time. Where are they going to book the test centers? Everything is closed.
Well, here's the thing. So I did this webinar. It was yesterday, the day before. I lose track of time in this weird, world where I don't leave the house. Very recently, last couple of days, there was this webinar with LSAC, and they went on record in this webinar saying, we're going to give you an at-home option. We're going to give you this online LSAT option. But from what I'm seeing with some other standardized tests, not law school related, but still standardized tests, bringing those exams, those standardized tests online in a way that's secure enough for the scores to be worth something is complicated. And I don't know that LSAC will be able to do that very quickly. They seem to think they'll be able to do that. They'll have this at-home option over the summer, potentially the fall. That might be optimistic too, right? So I wish they were less quixotic about what's likely to happen in the rest of the summer. I just don't see those tests happening. What about you, Steve?
Well, theoretically, I mean, given that they've already transitioned the LSAT to digital, they've actually done a lot of the work that would be necessary to do it online. True. They put the writing sample online. But here's the thing. The digital LSAT in-person administrations and the online LSAT writing sample administrations have tons of tech glitches.
Yeah.
And with the writing sample being online, your internet connection goes out, your cat comes into the background, screws up the security. Mm-hmm. It's not a big deal to re-administer the writing sample. They have 100+ versions of that. It's not scored. The stakes are not that high. But if you're halfway through a test and your internet glitches for even a moment, what happens then? Are they worried that someone gave you the answers during that one key moment?
Right.
It's hard to say. They're not going to make you redo the whole thing. So I think there's not an easy answer to this, unfortunately.
Here's a canary in the coal mine. You may have heard New York has canceled its July bar exam because they're not confident that they'll be able to do this in a secure way, right? Online.
And the stakes are obviously very high for the bar exam. I mean, if they're willing to cancel that, given the uncertainty.
Yeah, if you end up in big law, these big law firms, you can still work there and get paid. That's very common. You graduate from law school, you go to big law, you wait for your bar results. Hopefully you've passed. For those people who don't pass, it's not a big deal. They retake it in February. That's not the end of the world, but a lot of people don't end up in big law. And they need to be able to practice right away without the umbrella of a big firm, feeding them work every day. So that has a lot of consequences for a lot of people. So if the state bar in New York State is doing this, they do a lot of bar exams. If New York State is doing this with its bar exam in July, LSAC is somehow going to do better. I don't know.
Well, here's one thing they're doing, and you probably heard this on their webinar earlier this week.
Sorry, there
It's
went
all
the.
right. You
Did I
probably heard
just
some of
give
their
up?
webinar. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. I'll continue. So
All right.
LSAC had this webinar last week that we attended, and basically they talked about how they're changing things up to address all the uncertainty, the COVID issues. And one rather creative thing they're doing is they're letting anyone who was registered for March or April and had a canceled score on record, they're letting those students resurrect those scores. You can look at your canceled score, and if you
Yeah.
want to keep it, you can apply with that. And that's a way around this, to reuse the old stuff just so that you could apply with something. But that being said, I mean, I kind of feel like it's pretty late to be applying in this cycle anyway, and most folks would be better off waiting.
Well, I defer to you on all things LSAT, happily so. My thinking is if you canceled the score, there was probably a reason for it, right? So the fact that you can resurrect it doesn't necessarily mean you'll have a score that you're happy with, right? I guess the good news is that you get to see the score before you make that decision about whether you're going to use it or not, which frankly LSAC should be doing with any LSAT administration. I have strong opinions on this. It causes so much anxiety every single test administrations when people don't know whether they should cancel or not, which is just not an anxiety that you have to have if you take, the GMAT, for example. You look at your score, you don't like it, it goes away, nobody has to know. So I suppose there's some subset of people who canceled those scores and they shouldn't have canceled, and they'll be pleasantly surprised, right, when they uncancel it. But I think for a lot of people, that probably won't be the case. What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing that most canceled scores probably aren't great. I think there's never really a reason to cancel anyway, unless something went horribly wrong. But if you're hard up for a score, you have nothing on record, and you really need to apply now,
Yeah.
then why not look at it? I mean, they emailed everybody who is affected by this, and they're giving them the option. So I think you might as well take a look at it. There's really nothing to lose.
There is nothing to lose. That's exactly right. I just don't want people to get too excited.
Right? Yeah. But I mean, again, I'll go back to
you don't know what's under like door B, right?
Right.
You'll find out.
But given rolling admissions, I mean, I've typically heard it's not great to be applying in March or in April towards the end of a cycle unless you really need to be going this fall.
I think everything goes out the window for this coming cycle in terms of timelines. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if things really kind of get moved back for when people are submitting and when they feel that they have scores that they're happy with. Now, I realize you're an LSAT guy, but there is also a GRE option, right?
Yeah. I hate that there is one.
They purport to have an at-home GRE that they're offering to people who live in certain countries, to include the United States. However, not all law schools accept the GRE, right? Even among the top schools, most of them do, but there's some holdouts. The other problem we've discovered is we have applicants who need accommodations, and when they contact GRE to try to register for this at-home version, they're told, "Oh no, that won't work if you have accommodations. Sorry, we'll figure that out eventually," right? Which seems like a sort of a terrible policy to have. Among other things, among other problems, right? So I don't know that I feel totally comfortable saying, "Oh, just go take the GRE," right? Because there are a good number of people who, first of all, don't have that option to take it at home because they don't fall into one of the categories of people who can take it at home, but also because so many schools don't take it that it might not be a good investment for someone.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And also, as we know, there's such a tiny percentage of applicants actually accepted with the GRE. I don't think anyone's getting it with the GRE who wouldn't have gotten in with the LSAT.
Yeah, I get asked all the time, like, "Oh, can I take the GRE instead of the LSAT?" And, we just don't have a lot of historical data, right? It is new. It is an experiment for the law schools. I don't know that they'll take it forever, right? Maybe they like it, maybe they don't. I think it's really revealing that schools have started accepting both because, as you know, they're very different tests. So if they're testing these very, very different things, like what's the point of using it in your admissions process, right? If they're not even taking the same kinds of tests, right? And they're measuring very different things. So that's wonky to begin with. But yeah, what do I tell people? So what I've seen this past cycle, is the following. when I've told people don't look so much at the numbers in terms of the scores, look at the percentiles. And if the percentile on your GRE matches the percentile that you would want to have on the LSAT for a given school, then, treat those as roughly equivalent. Because what I found is, ETS has this conversion calculator, right? And of course, they've set it up in a way that benefits them. So when they convert a GRE score, in my opinion, it wildly inflates the LSAT score. Admissions offices are going to know this. And so what I'm seeing play out is that when people have what are optically good GRE scores, I think probably it's not treated the same as the supposedly equivalent LSAT score. So you might have to sort of overshoot and sort of gross up the GRE score that you're shooting for compared to the LSAT. Do you get asked that? Should I even consider the GRE? What do you tell people?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. I mean, the GRE is an easier exam. And so I agree with you what you said 100%. It's much easier to get a relatively higher score on the GRE than it is on the LSAT, both because the GRE is easier and because you're testing against a less competitive applicant pool. People are taking the GRE for everything.
Yes.
A little master's program,
oh, that's right.
a PhD
Everything
program, everything under the
Mm-hmm.
sun. The LSAT is tested against a much more competitive pool.
So being 90th percentile on the GRE is frankly just not as impressive as being 90th percentile on the LSAT, and there's no way around that. Right?
Exactly. And you also want to show admission officers that you're serious about law school in particular, not that you're doing this on a whim because you happen to have a GRE on record.
Right. Correct. Hopefully.
And then there's also the question of the rankings, right? So the GRE scores aren't considered in the rankings, but if your LSAT's above the median for a given school, you apply to that school, you can boost their numbers. Mm-hmm. That gives them a reason to offer you scholarship money or just to take you plain out.
Yeah. They don't need to recruit you for a GRE score, right?
Right. They have no incentive to do so. That's more just that they want to take you for some other reason or make you pay sticker maybe.
Yeah. Can I circle back to the timeline question? Because I'm seeing a lot of people posting questions around.
Hit the deadline question too, because that's a big one.
Yeah. So there's all this anxiety about like, oh my gosh, I thought I was going to submit nice and early, and maybe that's not even possible at this point because of the tests, among other things. And that is true. Like in normal years, and we're not in a normal year. In normal years, I bang that drum all the time. All else being equal, apply earlier rather than later in this very goofy rolling admissions system, which I don't defend. But that's how that works. I think all of that goes out the window in terms of timeline. I think every law school in the country is going to understand that you might not have the option even of getting all your ducks in a row nice and early. You might not be able to apply binding early decision if it's earlier in the cycle. I love how some schools have these different rounds of early decision, and the second so-called early decision is actually not early. It's the same deadline as regular, but they still call it early decision when what they mean is actually binding decision. But, these are just law schools. Why would, words matter? Anyway, I have opinions. So I would not lose any sleep over the timeline issue this year. Just the admissions officers all understand this weird pickle that you're in. They're in a weird pickle too, right? Their timelines are also completely out the window. So are they going to continue offering binding early decision next cycle? I don't know. I mean, in some ways, in a lot of ways, it's not a fair system to begin with because early decision, works to the benefit of some people and not others in some ways that make me squirrely. But then on top of it, you've got this other equity issue of like, I was in a place where I just couldn't take the test or I couldn't get accommodations because whatever, or, I was in a country where I couldn't take it. So I don't know, maybe they do away with binding early altogether, but I don't have that crystal ball. I wish I did. So you guys, I can see in the chat window, you're feeling so much anxiety about the timing. I think, this is the year where you have my blessing not to worry about timing. The thing I'm really curious about is whether law schools might possibly go test optional or just do away with the requirement entirely, at least for this year. It's a little bit different from all the test optional stuff you've been reading about for undergrad because this standardized test requirement is actually imposed by the American Bar Association. So unless the ABA waives that, law schools don't actually have any choice if they want to be accredited by the ABA. I think there's a strong argument that it should be waived just because of all these administration problems. Personally, I'd be okay with that. I'm not a huge fan of the standardized tests. I totally admire people like you who help people crack it, but I think the legitimacy of these tests in the admissions process, I think that is somewhat questionable. But the ABA doesn't listen to me. I wish they did, but it's just so revealing to see all this movement happening in the undergrad level, right? And that was already happening before the virus hit. There was already this test optional movement in process, right? And now it's just accelerating. And yet law schools don't have that flexibility at the moment. So it's kind of a goofy system.
Yeah, this really calls into question a lot of things about bureaucracy and rules and regulations, because this act of God, so to speak, with coronavirus throws everything, it kind of mixes everything up. And as you said, not only there's already been the test optional movement on the undergrad level, and now if they literally cannot administer the LSAT for how many months and people need to take it, people need to apply. And LSAC, if they can't figure out how to administer it online, although I know they're desperately trying to figure that out, if they can't get it done and people need to apply and law schools need to fill seats to make those tuition dollars, something's got to change. I mean, LSAC is kind of funny. They actually serve law schools more than they serve law school applicants. They consider the law schools their clients.
Yes,
so they've got to help law schools fill their seats. But LSAC also relies on the LSAT as its large reason for existence. So as you said, they're in a pickle.
Right? The LSAC, in theory, is just a consortium, really, of all the participating schools, right? However, I think their interests can really diverge here, right? If their constituent members decide, for whatever reason, this test isn't serving us so well anymore, arguably, LSAC's interests are going to be very different from the schools that are heading in a different direction. So there might be some kind of split coming. But again, this is all at the mercy of the American Bar Association, which, has a mind of its own.
Yeah, and for anyone interested in the language on this, if you Google ABA, valid and reliable admission test, that's the language used to require the LSAT or something else considered valid and reliable, which the GRE has been interpreted to fall within. Whether it does is an open question, but the law schools wanted more applicants, and so they've done it, and the ABA has not cracked down on that. And I don't think they're going to anytime soon, given that they need to get those applications, fill those seats.
That's right. I'm seeing a good question about splitters. What about people who are going to rely on a high LSAT score to compensate for other, sins in the application? And that's what I normally told people who have some kind of rocky thing in the rest of their application. Maybe it's a disciplinary problem or, some problem on the transcript. A really high LSAT score forgives a lot of sins at most schools. However, if for whatever reason you don't have the option this coming cycle to take the LSAT and get a nice high score, you're right. You're absolutely right. That is not going to work in your favor. I was doing an interview earlier today on Bloomberg TV where the person doing the interviewing said, this will be lowering standards if a college goes test optional. And I said, actually, no. What it does is it shifts the burden on the other parts of the app from the LSAT or the, undergrad case, SAT, ACT. It shifts the burden away from the standardized tests and it shifts it over to the other parts of the application, including your transcript, right? So if your transcript is not awesome and you are relying on a high LSAT to make this magic work, not a great situation for you. I don't have a great answer other than, you're going to have to come up with an interesting and true addendum to give them some context about what went on there, because you're not going to have the luxury potentially of a score to counterbalance that. I know, I wish I could give you better news.
I think that's a pretty good sum up there. And just for those who are wondering, will June happen? Will July happen with regard to the LSAT? It's really an open question. I don't want people to take our conversation to mean that the June and July LSATs definitely aren't happening.
No, we're just spitballing here.
We're just spitballing. I mean, I think it's pretty much a done deal. April's not going to happen, but depending on how flat the curve gets, it's possible that restrictions could be lifted around the world and certainly around the US, such that June could go forward, or July could go forward, or August could go forward, or LSAC could figure out online administrations. And so it's not a done deal. Wait and see what happens. Keep an eye on LSAC's website. Keep an eye on my YouTube channel and podcast for updates. But basically, June may go forward, July may go forward. Keep studying for the LSAT. And especially if you're relying on that number, to boost up your application if your GPA is terrible, then it's worth waiting a couple of months to see what happens. There's no rush here.
No, that's exactly right. And at the end of the day, I do suspect law schools will be pushing out their application deadlines for the coming cycle, not least because of all this uncertainty around testing and dates and such. So, if you can't take it until the next calendar year, whenever they might decide to administer it, I think that'll end up being okay. In other years, that's not so great. This year, I think a lot of people are going to be in that boat, and I don't think it's going to be a liability. And I think, they're going to push out that deadline to accommodate you guys because, they don't want to discourage you from applying, right? They want you to apply. They want to see you succeed. So I think they're going to take some steps to accommodate people who are having trouble.
No doubt. Yeah. I mean, the deadlines are all based on assumptions around the previous state of the world, pre-February, pre-March of this year, assuming everything was smooth. Now, as Anna, as you've been emphasizing, they really don't apply. In law schools, their job is to fill seats, not to stick to old deadlines. And so if they got to toss those out, they will.
Model, right? It's the airplane business model, which is they've got to have butts in those seats come orientation, right? And any seat that's not filled is a big revenue hit for this school. So that's why they keep these deep wait lists. They don't want any seats going unfilled in that 1L class. So the more people are kind of bouncing around and changing plans or deferring or whatever, you're just going to see a lot more spots opening up, I suspect, than in previous years. So I keep saying to people, hang in there. It's going to be a marathon and not a sprint. But if you're willing to incorporate some flexibility around sort of when you're submitting, when you're taking the tests, and you're okay with that inherent sense of unease, the law schools are feeling it too. They're feeling terribly anxious about this.
So here's a question for you related to that, Anna. Let's say if there is a counter cycle, meaning that law schools, there's a surge in applicants and law schools really want to get those seats filled. Do you see them before that in the current period? Do you see law schools in their desperation to fill seats? Do you see them offering more significant scholarship money in the next couple of months to anyone finishing out this cycle?
They might have to. And it's a perfect storm on their end too, because schools are all taking a financial hit right now, right? In a lot of different ways. And so the wealthier schools won't have any problem, moving some funds around and making this work. I think schools that don't have these huge endowments and are much more dependent on tuition to, balance the books, they're not going to have that luxury necessarily. So, I don't know where that equilibrium sort of, settles. But certainly money might be one way that they fix this problem to get butts in those seats, right? Yeah, that's a good point.
And here's a question for you about, let's say someone can't retake the LSAT as many times as they would want this year, or they're just figuring out their applications for the coming fall based on what's been happening over the past year. Do you see people writing a ton of how I survived the pandemic essays and addenda related? And what advice would you give someone who's considering talking about this in their application, especially as it might relate to college, the spring semester of college, where everything moved online?
Right. So all law schools are going to understand that you're going to have this semester where, maybe everything goes to pass fail, and you don't have the benefit of a bunch of A's that you were hoping to be able to calculate in your GPA. They all understand that this semester is just completely wonky, but guess what? They have a lot of other semesters to look at. They have other things they can take into consideration. I do think it will help to have a recommender, an academic recommender from this semester. If you're still in college, talk about your work, since you won't have grades possibly to show for this semester. So that might be one workaround. I would guess that for most people, doing the, my life in the coronavirus essay is not going to be the way to stand out. I think there are going to be a lot of really bad how I survived the coronavirus essays, and I'm sort of pitying admissions officers already. I mean, you saw this after all kinds of other crises. You saw this after Katrina, you saw this after 9/11, and it's not to just, to minimize any of those things. It's a very natural response that you want to talk about it and you want to make this central to your essay. But ultimately, your job as an applicant is to distinguish yourself, to stand out from among all these other fantastic, wonderful people, and they can accommodate everybody. So I would say don't be too quick to just, oh yes, that's the obvious topic, I'll write about it, because guess what? Lots of other people are going to be writing about it. It could be a totally legitimate thing to talk about in an addendum. So maybe you talk about it in an addendum as far as how it affected, different parts of your life as you were trying to put your applications together, right? Or as you're trying to go through college. But maybe you leave it there and don't necessarily put in your personal statement. Now, that being said, I don't want to just take it off the table and say it's just not appropriate for everyone. I think for some people, this is so life altering that they have to tell the story. Otherwise, an admissions officer couldn't possibly sort of understand who they are, and what they're getting in that 1L class if they join, right? And as one of the admissions officers on this webinar yesterday was pointing out, this crisis implicates laws in every way. What kind of lawsuits are going to revolve around liability when you have these new ventilators that people have to come up with, in an emergency, or what's the legality, the constitutionality of stay-at-home orders, right? I mean, there are constitutional aspects to this. There's just nothing that the law doesn't touch here in some way, right? And so I think for some people, this is going to be a very motivating experience. Might be why they're applying to law school, in which case I would say, don't take it off the table. You're allowed to talk about it. Just be mindful about it. Don't be reflexive about it. Don't think if you write the coronavirus essay that nobody else is doing it, because that's not going to be true, right?
Yeah, no, I really like that response. And I love the idea of tying it to some personal experience, but not necessarily making it the focus of the application. So maybe, as you said, in addendum where it directly affected the college experience or directly affected your work experience when you had a new job and then coronavirus hit and then you were remote or then you were out of a job, and how you handled it and what you learned.
Right. But that's a good question. There are going to be a lot of those essays.
I could certainly imagine. Yeah. So many good questions here.
So many questions. They're just
so many questions.
They are. I'm just scrolling.
Someone was asking about the cycles. So just to clarify that, the cycles run from June to May, at least the LSAT testing cycles do. And we've been talking a bit about applicants who would be starting law school this fall and have already submitted applications or are about to. And then we've also been speculating that it might possibly get more competitive for those applying this fall to start law school fall 2021, especially if there is a massive recession, which it seems likely there could be. And people want to wait it out because then you come out 3 years later, hopefully the economy is recovered and you haven't been searching for a job or unemployed or underemployed during that time.
I think as far as, so there's the sort of the LSAT cycle, which mostly overlaps with the admissions cycle, but typically applications will open up sometime in September. And you can submit the day after they open them up if you want to. Most people don't. And then they typically have rolling admissions up until sometimes it's February, sometimes it's March, sometimes it's April. I hate rolling admissions. I think it's ridiculous. I think it causes so much of this weird musical chairs every year. A lot of selective colleges don't do rolling. MBA programs don't do rolling, right? They have rounds with fixed dates. It's much more civilized, but here we are. This is the law school world. So, you can decide when you're going to submit in that time. And for most people, virus or no virus, crisis or no crisis, when they submit absolutely keys off of when they have not just when they have a score, but when they have a score that they're happy with. They're not the same thing, right? I think there are a lot of people, as you know, who take it and just, if I had $1 for every email I get that says, I've been scoring in the high 170s, so I'm, blah, 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 blah. And then, a lot of times that doesn't actually come to pass and it's a huge shock to them. Anyway, I tell people to plan on taking more than once. And if they don't need to, fantastic, but, budget that into your timeline. But as I was saying earlier, I wouldn't be surprised if kind of all bets are off as far as, you need to apply earlier rather than later. I think a lot of things are going to shift later. People are going to have their scores whenever they have them. They don't necessarily have control over that. And it's very possible that the deadlines are all going to scooch out as well. And they're not going to be whatever they were, this cycle, they're not going to be next year, I would guess.
Right. Right. And I just want to echo the retaking idea that typically, if you're able to, retaking is typically a good thing to do. I rarely come across someone who takes it once, is happy with their
Yeah.
score, and applies. And since law schools only take the highest score and do not average them, there's really not much downside to retaking if you think you could do better. And if you've got plenty of downtime now due to being stuck at home or more time than usual,
Mhm.
this is a great chance to give it your all and really focus on it.
Yeah, I agree. I will say that law schools will see all of your scores, but they have strong incentives to pay attention to the high ones. So and it's not like undergrad where you can do score select and all that kind of stuff. No, they're going to see all of your scores whether you like it or not. But they report the high score to the rankings via the ABA, and so they have strong incentives to care about the first one. Let me ask you this, and this isn't necessarily Corona related, but might come into a play given all the uncertainty about when people can take these and how many times they might retake it. When people retake it maybe a third time or a fourth time, I encounter a lot of magical thinking, right? There seems to be this assumption that, well, I just had a bad day the first time, and then I had a bad day the second time, and maybe I had a bad day the third time, and then the fourth time, it's all going to be very, very different. And I don't think that's typical, right? And what concerns me is when people peak at some point, and then they just want to keep going, and then they just keep adding scores that go down, which, yes, schools have to report the high score, but optically, is that the impression you want to give? Because then that high score starts looking like the big outlier, right? And it's the lower scores that seem to be, the truer score. So talk to me a little bit about that. What do you think about people who are taking it, who are these sort of serial LSAT takers?
Agreed. Yeah, I do tend to see some of that quite a bit from people emailing me, and I don't love it. I think that there's a point of diminishing marginal returns, and that
Mm-hmm.
magical thinking is a big part of this, where their practice test scores aren't really what they want them to be, but they're already registered for the test. There's that sunk cost fallacy with the test
Mm-hmm.
registration fees. So they just say they want to take it to see how they'll do. Maybe they'll get lucky. That's what I would advise against. And that's when you start racking up those low scores. If
Yeah.
you're not where you want to be before the test, you're not going to magically jump up there on test day. Postpone or withdraw your test registration so that
Right.
you don't get that extra take on record for no reason. Plus,
Right.
now there is that retake limit 3 times in one testing cycle, 5 times in 5 years, 7 times for life. And if you get a 180, you can't take it again. But bottom line for most
Seems
people,
fair.
yeah, pretty fair. But bottom line is that if you consider that limit and you're not where you want to be, no reason to cost yourself one of those retake opportunities.
Right.
Just withdraw, lose the $200. It's a drop in the bucket anyway. Register for the next one or the one after that when you really have the chance to give it your all. And like I said, now, if you're quarantined, if you're sheltered in place, if you have some more downtime than usual, you could watch Netflix here and there. At the same time, though, take advantage of the free time to buckle down and master the LSAT. There's no downside to being ready for it too early. These skills do not go away. It's not a memorization test. So
Right.
buckle down and study. And then if you could take it in June or July or August, knock it out then, and ideally apply at the beginning of the cycle.
Yeah, no, I really want you guys to be prepared because we don't know when the next opportunity will be to take the test. And so when that does become an opportunity, you want to be ready to go, right? So I know it's not fun unless you're Steve Schwartz. You probably don't want to live in LSAT land for too long. Some people enjoy it. A lot of people don't, so I understand it's not sort of the mode you want to be in for longer than you have to be, but given the uncertainty right now, be prepared, be ready to go for whatever the next test is, and then grab that opportunity, right? Get it out of the way.
Exactly. And here, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. You mentioned the binding early decision.
Mm-hmm.
Is there ever a circumstance in which you recommend somebody actually go for binding? Because to me, it seems like you would lose a lot of scholarship negotiation power.
There's the theoretical part and then there's the practical part. So in theory, yes, if you apply binding, you get an offer, you have to withdraw everywhere else. So you cannot just wait and see would I have gotten into Yale? Probably not. Would I have gotten into Harvard? Probably not. But that's a very real state, mental state that people are in. No, you get that early decision offer binding, you have to withdraw everywhere else, which means that you also don't have a chance to see what other scholarship offers you might have gotten, which means you won't have those to try to negotiate whatever, the early decision funding offer is. That being said, I would be very, very strategic about where you even consider applying binding. And then I reverse engineer from there. So whatever your stats are, I'd go to that LSAT calculator where you plug in your GPA, you plug in your LSAT score, and it'll show you, your odds of getting admitted to a whole range of schools based on just those two variables. And where the odds are coming back sort of roughly in the middle, call it 40 to 60%, those are not hard cutoffs, but sort of roughly that middle zone, that's where a binding application might make the difference for you. Because by definition, they're just sort of on the fence, and maybe you don't need one big plus to tip you over, maybe you just need one or two little pluses, right? And then binding can be one of those little pluses. If a school is a safety for you, of course, it doesn't make sense at all, right, to apply binding. If it's a reach, chances are applying binding isn't going to make any difference for you. It is not going to move the needle. Best case scenario, you're probably going to get deferred into the regular pool, and then you've lost the opportunity to apply binding somewhere where it might have made the difference for you, unless you're gaming the binding application deadlines, which is now a thing because, as we were talking about before, there's some quote unquote early decision deadlines that are actually later in the cycle. It's like a round 2 early decision. And so you could wait and see what happens with your first early decision. If they take a pass, then you can submit another binding one. But the key thing is you can only have one binding application out there pending at any given time. So if you are in that middle zone, and therefore a good candidate for applying early decision, how likely is it that they were going to use scholarship money to try to recruit you in a different scenario, in a regular non-binding scenario? Because at all but, I think, 3 schools, scholarship money for the schools is a recruiting tool. And they give scholarships out to try to recruit you away. Based on your numbers, they try to recruit you away from schools sort of higher up the food chain where you're likely to get an offer. And so if you're lower down the food chain, the only hope of them getting you is if they can lure you away on the cost side, right? So I would say if it was a reach school, you weren't going to get money likely. If you were in that middle zone, probably you weren't going to get a lot of money. By definition, you are most attractive to your safety schools, right? And of course, that's a moving zone, from applicant to applicant, right? So that's the situation a lot of applicants find themselves in. They get money from their safeties. They get little money from, the schools they actually really want to go to, and that can be a very hard decision. But that's typically how that plays out, and then you have to decide, is that money worth it to you? So I think as a practical matter, if you're being strategic about how you're using that early decision chip, you might not actually be trading off a ton of money, So I don't lose too much sleep about that. That all being said, if scholarship money is really, really important to you, don't do binding. Don't do binding. It's not worth it. Great question.
Do you see people tending more towards safety schools or schools that are more regional in nature as a result of coronavirus, given all the uncertainty, or given people not being especially uncertain about travel?
Yeah. So I don't know yet, right? Those deadlines, the deposit deadlines haven't come yet. So people are still weighing their options. I have seen applicants say, it's all of a sudden become really important to me to be close to home so that I'm in driving distance of my parents or my grandparents if something happens. I think that's very understandable. I think there's a certain range of schools where people are going to want to go no matter what, and if they get that offer, they will move across the country, right? But certainly proximity to their families and the people that they would want to be close to in an emergency situation, that could very well become more of a factor for applicants. But you and I both know there's schools where that's just not going to matter, right? People are just going to pack up and go if they get that call.
Right,
and that's
right.
fine.
What about, speaking of the travel restrictions, what about international applicants. I have the sense that a lot of international applicants may not be able to enter the country for the
No,
fall. They may have to delay towards the spring or wait and do it
totally
online.
sucks to be an international applicant because you just don't know if you're going to be able to travel at all. You don't know, if you get an offer, it might be pretty late in the game. And then is there even enough time to get a visa? Maybe yes, maybe no. Yeah, it's not pretty for international applicants. I feel for you guys. I don't know a fantastic way around that other than maybe you kind of sit this out and wait for things to settle so that you have a bit more lead time, right, to get all your ducks in a row, because there might not be any other way for you, which is unfair. I know, it sucks.
Yeah, agreed. I feel like international applicants always kind of get the short end of the stick with the scholarship money for federal loans and all that, of course. And then if they can't even enter the country and they don't want to do it online, I get the sense that probably waiting a cycle is the best way to go. Or I think there are only 3 or 4 ABA approved online law schools, but I'm wondering if maybe as a result of this, there might be more in the coming years.
There might be more. Yes, there might be more. So from what I can tell, and this is not my area of expertise, but from various people I've talked to, providing an education online takes expertise and often months, if not years, to do right. And so, making that all work and really delivering an actual remote education as opposed to, well, we're just kind of moving this online and hope it all comes together. I don't think that's a fast process. There are some universities out there that have really perfected it. I'm not even going to talk about the for-profits. They're evil. Among the nonprofit schools, that would be Arizona State is a huge innovator. They're so far ahead of everybody else in terms of delivering online education. Also Southern New Hampshire, right? Most schools aren't anywhere near as good as they are yet at delivering an actual education online. As heroic as everyone is being right now, trying to make this work on Zoom or whatever, it's just, there's real expertise behind it and a lot of innovation to make that work. Say the law schools do that, and that works for the ABA and everyone's reasonably happy with it. I'm really curious if law schools can keep charging what they charge.
That was my next question. Should one pay the same amount for an online law school as an in-person when you're missing out on all of the networking opportunities, all of the extracurriculars, the clinics?
Right. We were talking about that earlier in our discussion. Is 1L certainly, but the rest of the entire law school experience, you are bonding with your classmates because you're all in these trenches together. And when you're accepting an offer from a law school and you commit to going there, you are also investing. You're investing not just in that education and not just those 3 years. You're investing in your alumni network for the rest of your life, right? And how strongly do those bonds form in an online scenario? I don't have a good answer for that, but I'm certain that it's going to be quite different from the social aspect of going to law school in the real world. And I don't know how that can be replicated, and it might not be. But again, are people going to be willing to pay for that? Now, law is a cartel, right? It's a legal cartel. You cannot practice law without a law degree. Doesn't matter how smart you are. Doesn't matter if you're an awesome paralegal. If you don't have that law degree, the cartel keeps you out, right? And it's legal. That's all kosher. So if you really want to practice law, you're not going to have any choice but to go get that law degree. There are some exceptions here and there, not the norm, right? The Kim Kardashian exception.
I was just going to say, I was trying to hold it back.
We had to go there. It was just inevitable.
It's all right. It's all right.
Kardashians had to come up. So for those who don't know, in California, which is where I am, they have a very outlier system where you typically join the bar by passing the bar exam and doing some other things. And you typically have to have gone to law school first, but they have this exception where you don't have to go to law school, but if you sort of apprentice yourself and, somehow master test prep for the exam and can pass it, that's another way to join the bar, but that's not typical at all. So I'm going to put aside the Kim Kardashian situation, right? So if it's really important to you to practice law, you have to get a law degree. Does that mean you have to go with the most expensive law degree? No, right? And you might decide, you know what, if I'm not getting all these benefits of an in-person experience, maybe now I'm really focusing on the price tag and maybe less on the name. If that turns out to be the better deal for you. And I think that's very defensible, because ultimately, what's more important to you, going to a specific school that, you know, you have in your head that you have to go to that school? And I get that, we've all been there. Or is it more important to you to actually go out and practice law and do cool stuff as a lawyer? You know, because if it's the latter, and if that's the end goal, there are a lot of different ways you can get there. They all require a JD, right? But you know, there are a lot of different paths to that. And so maybe you have to uncouple that end goal from a sort of traditionally narrow view of what kinds of schools you'd be willing to consider.
I agree. And I like the bifurcation there, where we have like maybe the top 14 or the top 20 law schools where the in-person on-campus experience really matters. The name really matters, especially depending on your specific career goals. Big law being first and foremost among them, I would imagine with having that name on your resume. But in many other cases, and more than you might think, the brand name school might not matter that much. And if you want to save some money, you have a high LSAT score, you can get a full ride somewhere lower ranked. And maybe given coronavirus, you don't want to travel too far. You want to stay regional or maybe go online, just get that JD, have the degree, and then really do whatever you want with it in your own area.
And regional might just be more attractive to you now anyway, because you want to be close to home and close to the people, you know, that you want to be able to take care of in a crisis situation. So maybe you decide, I don't even really need a national law school. I don't need to have all those doors open all around the country, all around the world. You know, maybe a regional degree, meaning that degree has the most currency and the most name recognition and the biggest alumni networks kind of within a certain orbit, a certain radius around home turf. That's what I would define as a regional school. Maybe that's completely fine, and it's become more attractive than it might have been before, right?
Agreed. And I do want to address one parenthetical point here that someone raised in the comments around the support that one might get from an online school in terms of internships or career counseling. How much value would you place on that sort of support in general? And do you think it's a big deal if that's somewhat lacking from the online schools, if it in fact is lacking?
I do think it matters. What I don't mean to suggest is that schools won't be able to figure out how to do that online, you know, so I'm not necessarily dismissing that, but certainly those parts of your JD experience are important. You might need academic support. You're going to want career counseling. You know, there are all kinds of, you might need the dean of students for one reason or another. Those things really matter. Do they all have to happen in person? You know, I don't want to assume that that can't be done in an online universe or can't be done well in an online universe. I think right now and for the foreseeable future, we're all going to discover how much we're actually capable of in a purely online universe. I mean, with my consulting business, we've been online from day one. We've never been in person, and we set everything up intentionally so that we could work with people anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. Our consultants could be anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. You just got to work around the time zones, right? And my advice to people looking for test prep has also always been, you know, we're in this millennium. You don't necessarily have to go with the closest. You can go with the best, whatever that might be, right? Same might be true for education, right? Might not matter so much that you be able to sit in the same room together, right?
Agreed. And I mean, we're doing this right now online. I do all my stuff online, and I've almost always done everything online, and it's fine. We can still connect, still share the information. It just requires a bit more creativity to simulate some of those other aspects that otherwise might be neglected. But
it'll
what
be
matters
hard
most is the information and that connection.
Yeah. And I would say, you know, from what I can tell, I'm not practicing law at the, you know, right now, and, you know, maybe I never will again. But a lot of legal practice right now has to happen virtually too. I mean, my mother's a juvenile lawyer, and she was on, God bless them, the state court system doesn't use Zoom. They use WebEx, which just, you know, boggles my mind. But I'm glad they're using something at all. So, she was on WebEx today, talking to the other lawyers, talking to the judge, because, that's the only way you can do it right now. Same thing with medical practice, right? I mean, there are certainly all kinds of instances where you might prefer to be able to sit in a room with someone, right? More so even than in a law school situation, certainly, right? And yet they're all having to adapt as well. So everyone's adapting, and there's no reason law schools can't do it as well.
Exactly. Just takes some creativity and the desire to do so.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And the ABA has been very snobby about it. There's a reason that there aren't that many online offerings. If you're interested in a JD, they're going to have to loosen up some of that snobbery, I think.
Definitely. I think they'll have to out of necessity for the law school's benefit, along with the students too, just to make those connections happen and get those butts in those seats.
Yeah. Now, the upside is, see, I'm Generation X. I might be the oldest person on this whole forum today. I will say that one of the things that you guys do so well is, of course, networking and having social relationships not in the real world, right? You're totally comfortable with that. You're digital natives. I like living there too, but when, I didn't grow up with that, so it hasn't been all I've ever known. So I think if anybody is going to be able to embrace it and make it work and still have these social relationships, even though they're all online, you guys are, you were born for this. You're totally set up for this. So I actually have a lot of confidence that you will find ways to make your own communities and to get that benefit of a social structure and a support structure, even if you're not all sitting in a room. And let me tell you, certainly in law school, a lot of times, unless it's a small seminar class, you're sitting in some giant classroom, and you're all just sitting in your little seats and you're taking notes, and somebody's somebody's on the hot seat getting called on. And that all can happen online. I'm not worried about that at all. I'm thinking about things like, the study groups that form and the intramural football team, right? And then you mentioned clinics earlier, although those I think will go online as well. I don't think that's going to stop. Law reviews can go virtual. I did law review. Oh my God, if you want, pure grunt work just for resume value, law reviews are the way to go. Those don't have to happen in person. So you guys will find a way to have your community online. I have total confidence in that.
Agreed. And I think we see it happening more and more already during the beginning of the pandemic that we've been experiencing over the past couple of weeks. I mean, the LSAT Unplugged Facebook community is more active than ever. I'm seeing Instagram being more active than ever. People are coming together, especially when they're sheltered in place. That's the only way to get that connection and share the information.
Only way to do it. We're all making do. I'm laughing because someone posted, "Nope, you're not the oldest. I'm 61." So hats off to you. I admire you greatly. But at 61 as well as I do, this is a new world in terms of the law school experience for a lot of people, or even the college experience for a lot of people. The irony is, having an in-person residential education experience is a luxury. It is not even an option for tons of people, especially at the undergrad level. So non-traditional students have been working in this online system for a good long time, right? And that's nothing to sniff at. They have a lot of experience with this. And schools that cater to non-traditional students are going to have an advantage as well. So this very kind of cushy, on-person, residential, this is some important personal development experience, that I be here physically. There are lots of people who've never had that because that's really expensive to deliver, right? And a lot of people just haven't had access to that sort of highly selective environment that offers that kind of education. So I know I've been focusing a lot on this residential model and this sort of in-person model as if, that's the platonic ideal or, that's what everyone does. It's absolutely not what everyone does, right? It's a very specific way of delivering education. Law schools have been very clustered there in a way that undergrad has had a lot more variation.
Well, I think this is a classic example of disruption here in online education. Education and higher ed, law school in particular, has been very slow to adapt due to the cartel bureaucratic restrictive model. But this could be the massive tsunami that really forces them to breaks open the floodgates and requires them to change their ways. Because if you're paying $50,000 a year for a top level private school for the in-person full frills experience, but you can get the no frills experience for half that price or less, and law schools can actually afford to deliver it at that price. You're not paying for the fancy new student center and all the massages and everything during finals time. A lot of people will opt for the significantly cheaper option.
I think so. And I think that's totally defensible. I'm liking that you used the word disrupt because, that word, the D word, it gets bandied about all the time. And originally, of course, it came from Clay Christensen at Harvard Business School. And if I recall correctly, he developed this concept in a way that's much narrower than I think people now routinely use the word. In this case, it's very apropos because he was also very active in very early on thinking about online education and how to innovate in that space. So he had a lot to say about it. He studied it. He was a big proponent of it before he died. Rest in peace. So I think this is a totally legitimate use of the word. So I applaud you for that.
Thank you. And anyone interested in that should look up The Innovators Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. Fascinating book. Definitely changed my thinking.
Since then, he wrote some books specifically about online education that are super interesting, at least to people like me.
Yeah, no, it's good stuff. Anyway, I think we've hit all the major points here.
Oh my gosh, an hour has flown by.
It's been a blast as always. I love doing
this so much with you, Steve. I'm totally game to do this whenever. This is so great.
No, this has been a pleasure again. And for those interested, we've done a few discussions in the past on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. Folks can look those up for more. But anyway, before we sign off, Anna, do you just want to share your information, best way for folks to get in touch with you with any follow-ups?
Yeah, sure. Best thing to do is just to go to my website, which is annaivey.com. Self-explanatory, it's my name. Just remember there's an E in Ivey, so that sometimes people get wrong. And then there's a contact page where you can shoot me messages if you like. You can sign up for the newsletter. I've been writing one daily, more recently.
Nice.
And there's so many updates, thing you sent last week is already outdated, right? So do sign up for the newsletter because, I try to pump those out pretty regularly. But
awesome. Steve, things are changing really fast. And Anna has been in this business for a long time, former UChicago Law Admissions Dean, lots of great information that she's sharing out there. And folks who are interested in following me can reach me through the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast, Facebook group, Instagram, all that good stuff. And I'll send out some links after this as well. So thanks so much to everyone for joining. Thanks, Anna, for the great conversation as always.
I'm so grateful that all these people showed up. I'm sure they're, as you were saying before, Netflix beckons, me too. I mean, there's so many things you'd rather be doing right now than talking to Steve and me, and yet here you are. So thank you for that. That's very flattering.
Of course. Well, thanks everyone again. Please stay safe, be well, and hopefully this thing will be over sooner rather than later.
Yes, God willing. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.